Good morning, everyone. I just woke up, so this is gonna be fun. A couple weeks ago, I stumbled onto a site of YouTube that I never knew existed, and I don't know what to call it aside from boat sinking YouTube. It mostly centers around the Titanic, but it also focuses on a lot of other major maritime disasters, and everyone over there seems to know everything about everything. Except I couldn't find a good video about the company that made the Titanic, so I decided that's what I was gonna do. So, hello, today we're talking about the White Star Line, from birth to death, basically. I'm not gonna go into super in-depth detail on this. It's just gonna be more of a company overview. I'm also not gonna be talking too much about the specifics of the boats themselves, just because, one, I'm not a boat person, I don't know much about that, and so that's just asking for me to majorly screw up. This is gonna be more like a company history and just an overview of what happened. But there are kind of two versions of the White Star Line. The first one was started in 1845 in Liverpool. It was started to hop on all the gold rushes that were happening in Australia, so that was the main focus, was Australia. Originally, it had just some small charter ships until it acquired the Royal Standard, which was its only steamship at the time. And then it had its first two disasters. So the company did not get off on the right foot, and you'll see it did not stay off on the right foot throughout its history. The RMS Taylor, one of its charter boats, crashed and sunk, and it was the first major shipwreck of its time. And then not too long after that, the flagship of the company, the SS Royal Standard, and its only steamship hit an iceberg and had to be converted back to a sailboat because it got so damaged. So clearly things were going great for the company. The company wasn't super big, and so it ended up merging with two other major companies to form the Oriental Steam Navigation Company, and then not too long after, it went bankrupt. So yeah, that's White Star Line Parte Uno, dead. And then in 1968, the shell of the company, which was basically just its name and logo, was bought by a man named Thomas Ismay with the intent to focus on North Atlantic sailing, which is where most of what we know, or most of what most people know about the company, comes from. He approached the Harland and Wolff Company to commission some boats for him, and so they introduced the Oceanic class, which consisted of the Oceanic, Atlantic, Baltic, and Republic. They were pretty big ships. The Oceanic's maiden voyage was on March 2nd of 1871. It didn't end up completing the voyage and had to go back for repairs, so off to a great start again. The first major disaster was the sinking of the Atlantic. It happened on a pretty stormy night off the coast of Canada. The captain was asleep and the crew was trying to get the boat into Halifax, and it ended up crashing into one of the rocks on the shore. The boat hit, keeled over, and it ended up flooding a bunch of the decks, and so pretty much all the passengers drowned. Only one child survived and none of the women did. 562 out of the 900 some odd people died. The vast majority were women and children, unfortunately. Most of the men on board made it out alive. It was the crew. Probably because this happened in the middle of the night, and so no one woke up in time to be able to get up out of the boat. And 59% of the people on board died. So not too long after the disaster of the Atlantic, two new steamers were ordered. They were the Britannic and the Germanic, and they were launched in 1874, but they didn't enter service until 1879. The Britannic was quickly declared surplus and then sold off. Before that happened, both of the boats got the blue ribbon, which is, it's kind of like an award for the fastest boat at the time. It gets handed out to whatever the fastest ship is, and then it's a blue ribbon that the boat flies underneath its flag to show, like, hey, I'm the fastest. So yeah, it's a big deal. And a lot of companies ended up passing it around as they all tried to outcompete each other. So at this point, the company took a bit of a shift from making passenger boats, and they started focusing on cargo and livestock boats, and they added a new small one down near New Zealand. However, at this point, this worked for a while, but then the passenger boats started growing obsolete in terms of speed and comfort when compared to ships from competing companies, especially from the Cunard line. That's probably the biggest competitor for the White Star Line. So because of that, the White Star Line decided to sell off some of its older ships, and then it ordered 2 new liners, the Titanic and the Majestic. And they were new fancy ships with 4 decks and actually featured the 3-class passenger system for the first time in the company history. And they launched in 1889, making maiden voyages in 1889 and 1890. In case you knows me keeping looking over, I'm just looking at my script. So. And this was when the company started to really refocus on passenger ships again. They start trending more towards making bigger and more comfortable boats instead of focusing on faster ones. The big first step really in this direction of more comfortable, bigger boats was the Britannic, which was considered an intermediate liner, consumed less coal, and was very much more an economical boat for traveling. From there, the company just continued trying to win over the competition. Before the Oceanic, the boat line already had plans in store for the Big Four. The Big Four consisted of the Celtic, the Cedric, the Baltic, and the Adriatic. All of these were declared the largest ship in succession from each other, except for the very last one, poor Adriatic. Though she did end up being the first ocean liner to have an onboard swimming pool, so I mean. And also in the process of making the Big Four, the company did attain some smaller boats. Not much happened. Some intermediate boats were attained and renamed, but to match the company endings that all end in IC. You guys have probably noticed the pattern by now, but these boating companies tend to have some sort of pattern in how they name their boats, and White Star Line went with IC endings. So also added to the catalog of routes in the North Atlantic run, there was an express route that went from Southampton to New York, and it became a normal route for the major ships to take. And then sometime in the middle of this, another notable accident happened. The RMS Republic collided with the Lloyd Italiano class. Haven't heard of that. Their ship, the Florida, gave the first come quick danger distress call because SOS wasn't a thing yet. And then the abandoned ship call. Luckily, it seems like everyone made it out pretty okay. They evacuated to the Florida, and then they all went onto a ship that was not collided with. The Republic lasted until help arrived, and then it was getting towed back to get repaired, and then it sank. Luckily, it decided to do so after everyone was off. So in this intermittent period for the White Star Line, the Cunard Line went and they released probably 2 of their most well-known boats, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. They both got the blue ribbon, and so the White Star Line was like, okay, we're gonna make the Olympic class. These ships, as with the Big Four, they focused on size and luxury compared to speed. So this is where we go into more detail about boat stuff. A big notable part of these ships' designs were their high number of watertight compartments down in the bottom of the boat. So the thing with the watertight compartments at the very bottom of the boat is the idea is if the boat gets punctured in a spot, the compartment can be sealed off and then it won't flood. It'll be fine. It'll fill up that compartment only, and then otherwise the boat will be able to keep on going. This was kind of a controversial design though, because some people thought like, hey, if you have the water only on one side of the boat, you're gonna make it more likely to capsize. They went ahead and still did the compartments anyway. The first of these boats was the Olympic. It started this construction in December of 1908, launched to the following year. She had her maiden voyage in 1911, but later that same year, she had the first big disaster experienced by the Olympic class. She collided on her way out from port with the RMS Hawk, which punctured a hole in her side. And luckily she was still right there. She hadn't gone very far, so it was pretty easy to just yeet her back into port and get her all patched up. But yeah, that was not great. Then in early 1912, she ran over. The only thing that I saw this be ever called was a submerged object, but she ran over a submerged object over the coast of Canada, off the coast of Canada. She made it all the way back to Holden Wolf in the UK at half speed somehow, just fine. So, I mean, yeah, things weren't going great for this boat. Luckily though, she survived this and she was a part of the White Star Line for many years until she became outdated and redundant and was eventually scrapped. So the next boat you're probably pretty familiar with. Her name is the Titanic. She started construction in 1909, launched in 1911. The incident with the Olympic running into the Hawk kind of slowed down her construction a bit. And of course, we're all familiar with her maiden voyage. So her maiden voyage happened in 1912. She was sailing out of England, heading to New York. The journey started on April 10th of 1912. And then late in the night, like almost to midnight, on April 14th? Yes. On April 14th, she spotted an iceberg and tried to port around it. Instead of having a head-on collision, she managed to instead have her like side scrape this iceberg, and it tore open 6 of the compartments. They all flooded, and this is part of where you see the capsizing problem come in, because she tore more compartments than we're supposed to be able to. The boat started sinking. This boat also did not have all the lifeboats it was supposed to have on it, or even could have. These boats were made to hold 68. And she was carrying only 20 lifeboats. The problem got worse when only like the first ones were launched with like not even half capacity. They were practically empty. The life jackets were not a problem, but also life jackets don't do much when the water is super frigid, and so you die from hypothermia instead of drowning. By the time all was said and done, 1,514 people died out of the 2,224 on board. Also, another mystery about the boat is we don't really know what happened to the captain. There's conflicting sources on what happened. Some people say they saw him drown on board. Some people say they saw him chuck himself off the side. I think I even saw one where they saw him floating next to a lifeboat, so they think that he might have tried to get in. We're not really sure. All we know is that he did die somehow in the process. So Britain went ahead and was like, well, time to pass more safety laws so that this doesn't happen again. And that helped out a whole lot for the Britannic. So the other sister ship to the Titanic, the Britannic, started construction in 1911, went through design changes after the sinking of the Titanic to make that not happen again. And then she was launched in 1914, taking even longer to build than the Titanic did. She originally had the title RMS, but this changed to HSMS when war broke out, and she became Her Majesty's hospital ship. World War I broke out. She didn't sail until 1915 because of this. She didn't have a civilian maiden voyage. Her maiden voyage had to do with war. In 1916, she hit an underwater mine. So this happened. She was off the coast of Greece. She was in the middle of a chain of islands, and so the captain was like, okay, we're really close. We're only a couple miles offshore. So we're going to keep going and try to run the boat aground. So they didn't completely lose the ship, and they wouldn't sink with a whole bunch of people on board, because I think there were about 1,066 people on board for this. They seemed to have a pretty good emergency drill down. People just went to their stations naturally. There was not much chaos about on board. There were also a bunch of nurses, and they all really impressed the men with how bravely they acted. They did not get super scared and panicky like women were stereotyped to do at the time. And so things were going pretty smoothly, and then some lifeboats launched early without approval, and this is where most of the problems come with the boat sinking. What the problem was the boat was keeling, and it was kind of tilting forward, and the propellers were lifted up out of the water a little bit. They were partially unsubmerged. And they were turning the water in such a way that it created a vortex, and the water was pulling water into them. 2 lifeboats were released prematurely, and they ended up in this vortex, and they both got carried into the propellers. And this is where most of the casualties come from. As you can imagine, a boat and a propellers is not good. They got chopped to bits, and a lot of people also got chopped to bits by this. And this is where the vast majority of the deaths that occurred in the sinking come from? Luckily though, people saw that and they were like, well, why don't we wait until actual approval or until the boat stops? So eventually the captain did stop the boat when he saw, okay, we're not gonna make it, she's sinking too fast, we gotta get off this thing. So then they started actually releasing the lifeboats. At this point, some of the lifeboats had been lowered, but they just weren't allowed to hit the water so as to not get pulled into the vortex. And then now they released them all. They got everyone off, pretty much everyone. And then they watched the boat go down. She had the same captain throughout her whole life, and he actually made a remark something along the lines of how amazing it is to see a boat's lifespan from like birth to death, basically. And when all was said and done, only 30 people died, which is less than 3% of the people on board. I think when I calculated it, it was 2.8% of people on board died. Which is, let's see, we have 58% for the RMS Taylor, 59% for the RMS Atlantic, I think it's actually the SS Atlantic, I wrote that down wrong, and 68% for the RMS Titanic. So 3% is not bad at all, but they still lost the ship. By now, 2/3 of the Olympic class was dead underwater, so this did not bode well for the company. Other ships were lost in the course of World War I, but the biggest major ones were the loss of the Titanic and the Britannic. The company still did well for a while, especially right after the war when transatlantic immigration increased a bit. But then in 1924, the United States decided to put quotas on immigration, saying only so many people from a certain country can come here, to kind of slow things down. America was also very xenophobic at this time, which didn't help. Their business dwindled a little bit, but there was still a lot of tourism going on, so they were able to keep that up. But the company ended up being bought out by the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, which is a wild name. And they were planning to make another big ship, laying the keel down for it, but then they decided to go ahead and break it into 2 smaller ships, and they made the 3rd Britannic and the Georgic. Not too long after that, though, the Great Depression hit, and so no one was traveling at this time, and so the company was about to go bankrupt, and in order to receive assistance from the government, they were forced into a merger with the Cunard Line, and they stayed with the Cunard Line until about 1950, 1949-ish, when the Cunard part of the company bought out the White Star Line part of the company. And so even though the White Star Line flag continued to be sailed from the boats after this, the company was dead. Also, a small thing to mention, I guess as a side note, throughout all of this, the White Star Line also had an Australia run. It was not nearly as big, but it was also not nearly as eventful as the North Atlantic run. None of the boats sank on this one. They all were fine. The only boat that did sink was the Afrique, and it sank during World War I, so it wasn't even on the Australia run. So it was profitable. It didn't continue for the rest of the company's history, but it was there for quite a good while. It was profitable. It was pretty chill. So not much to mention about that because it's pretty uneventful. Not many people talk about it for good reason, because there's no reason to talk. So yeah, that's the White Star Line. I just meant this to be like the broad sketches of the company history, and this is turning out to be a very long video. So I'm gonna shut up now. Have a good day.